Well, going to war is a decision any government must weigh carefully. After all, people's lives are at stake. This week, Canada chose to extend its 6-month commitment to war in the Middle East for another 12 months, and from one country to two, as we're now about to bomb ISIS positions in Syria as well as Iraq. Andrew, Chantal, and Bruce are all here in studio tonight. Surprised about the extension and the expansion of the mission?
Not at all, really. I think a lot of people were predicting this. It's more remains the same than has changed. It's still a limited mission, both in time and in resources. 6 planes, 69 Special Forces people, and some support crew. And I think with a very limited and reasonable mandate, which is to try and hold the line on ISIS, to try and prevent and contain them from expanding
Defeat
further.
Now, defeat is the term they're using.
Well, but that's not going to happen anytime soon, I think most people would acknowledge. But what has to happen is to contain them first, to give the people who are on the ground there, mostly local forces, the opportunity to regroup and try to build themselves into a proper fighting force. The alternative of simply leaving ISIS to overrun them, as they were doing back in October when we first went in, I don't think is palatable to anybody in the international community. And if somebody has to fight them, if the international community is fighting them, it's not unreasonable to me that Canada would be part of that international mission.
Chantal?
I think once we went with a military role in October, it was a foregone conclusion that this would be extended. And for a year works for logistical reasons. We're not going to be reviewing that decision in the middle of an election. So I guess the main question is, we've extended it to a second country on the basis that's where ISIS is. So does that mean we could extend it to yet more countries in a year, because ISIS could move from Syria to Yemen or Libya, name it. And if we do that, what does it say about the efficiency of what we're actually doing? That we are chasing ghosts from up in the sky. And it still leaves the question of whether a ground war would be the only efficient thing. And no one wants to get into that. So,
Bruce?
Well, certainly not surprised at all that the government decided, having entered that situation, that they were going to extend their mission, and a little bit surprised at the idea of expansion. I think that, you know, the government is obviously possessing a lot of information that tells it that this is a useful thing to do and a constructive thing to do. I don't think that they were making this decision simply on the basis of the conventional wisdom about the politics of it or the short-term politics. That having been said, I think there is a conventional wisdom that this will work out really well for the Conservatives, that it's a popular war, in quotation marks. And I guess I look at it and go, you know, if a week is a long time in politics, as people say, 24 or 25 weeks, the time between now and the election, that's an infinity. And there are lots of other scenarios that could intervene. The Americans could mismanage their role. The government could mismanage the communications of their role, and we've seen some examples of that. So I think the Conservatives probably took the only decision that they thought was logical and appropriate, but I think they should recognize that this is always going to be tentative support by Canadians, and there's no military mission that's, in quotes, popular.
One of the fundamental differences between going into Iraq and going into Syria is the Iraqis asked Canada to be involved and asked the Americans to be involved. Syria hasn't. There are a number of differences to that. They're all kind of played out on the floor of the House of Commons yesterday in this exchange between Tom Mulcair and Stephen Harper. Watch this.
Has the Prime Minister written to the United Nations laying out Canada's justification for their planned intervention in Syria?
I'm not sure what point the leader of the NDP is ultimately making. If he is suggesting, Mr. Speaker, that there is any significant legal risk to lawyers from ISIL taking the government of Canada to court and winning, the government of Canada's view is that the chances of that, Mr. Speaker, are negligible. We are clearly defending not only the wider regional interest, but
extraordinary, Mr. Speaker, living in a Canada where that sort of idiocy passes for argument.
Well, I obviously won't repeat the terminology used by the leader of the NDP. If his idea of protecting Canada's national interests is that you don't do everything in your power legally, militarily, and in terms of cooperation with allies to defend the interests of this country against the terrorist caliphate. He and I obviously have very different ideas of what the national interests of this country are.
The Prime Minister of Canada thinks he's above international law also. He's not, and Canada is not. That's all we got.
All right, a lot of people have been asking for a debate around this motion, as they did in the last one 6 months ago. There is a debate going on in the House now, but that was as close as you got to real action between a couple of the major players yesterday. However, it had its moments in there. What did you make of it, Chantal?
You can only hope that Stephen Harper was not thinking and that he knows these things. And today the government did say that they were going to talk to the UN because the substantive point was being made by Thomas Mulcair. And it looked like Mr. Harper was borrowing a page from Justin Trudeau and turning it into ridicule. But it is a fact that you can't just say we're not going to ask a host country whether we can bomb over their territory without making the case somewhere that there are legal reasons within the international law parameters for doing it. The Prime Minister's answer was not the kind of answer you would expect from a Prime Minister.
Bruce?
Yeah, I think that the substantive question that Mr. Mulcair was raising was clearly one that the Prime Minister was unprepared to answer. He just didn't know the details of what was going on, and the government kind of looked pretty error-prone on that point today. I think the stylistic question is the most important one, really, in some respects, because if the Prime Minister continues to answer serious questions about this initiative in that style, if Minister Nicholson continues to use the kind of language that reminds me of how Joe Oliver talked about people who opposed oil sands development or had some anxieties about oil sands development, basically saying you're un-Canadian if you don't agree with every step that we take with respect to this mission. The Conservatives will come to regret using that kind of language. It's a little bit like trying to stretch a single into a triple. There's more risk for them in pushing the language as hard as some of them have been doing.
Where are you on this?
I agree that the Prime Minister's tone was not the best. I'm not sure how serious and substantive the point that Mr. Mulcair was making. I mean, 6 months ago, Mulcair was jumping up and down because we were waiting upon the permission of a dictator and not going out. He didn't want us to go in, but he was outraged that we were waiting for his permission. Now he's outraged because we're not asking his permission. Bashar al-Assad is not actually in position to give that permission in the territory that we're going to be flying over because it's not under his control. It's under ISIS's control. On top of which, he himself is completely illegitimate in the eyes of the international community, having perpetrated genocides himself. But it's also notable that under the Responsibility to Protect doctrine, which we helped formulate, which 150 countries have signed on to, if a country is unwilling or unable to stop mass atrocities from taking place, then the international community is justified in going in. So to be standing on kind of niceties of international law at a moment like this, to be saying that you didn't go and ask permission from the Security Council, which effectively means asking permission from Russia, you know, for whom Syria is a client state, to be making those kinds of interjections and oppositions, I think is simply covered for the fact that he just doesn't want us to be involved in the war at all.
The good news is that Stephen Harper's people could get their answers from Andrew, and it would have been a substantive answer. The bad news is that the government did, in the end, say today that it is writing the United Nations, as the U.S. did, because while the doctrine of the right to protect exists, no country is the sole arbiter of I wake up tomorrow and we have a right to protect. And it is a legitimate question in the sense that if you are saying that about Syria, and what Andrew says is quite true, those points are all well taken, you could apply that to a hell of a lot of other countries. And Canada is not, I don't think, in a position to make those judgments. There has to be a frame somewhere. And I think that was Mulcair's point, is that there is an international frame for those interventions. You can't wake up one morning and say, oh yeah, Boko Haram's lawyers are not going to come after me, so let's go bomb this country or that country.
I guess one could think, though, when you see them today deciding that they are going to write to the UN, that they really didn't have their ducks in a row for all the planning they had coming up to this. I mean, as you said, Andrew, from the beginning, this was kind of expected all along. You'd think they would have had that. How much is politics playing into this whole issue as we're, you know, heading towards an election on everybody's parts throughout this debate this week? And the greater issue in terms of security, C-51, ISIS, Iraq, Syria, is politics running through all the decision-making on this?
Yeah, pretty much all, I would say. I do think that for the Prime Minister, he does well when people believe that he's a sober, sound judgment type Prime Minister, that he's kind of putting aside his partisanship as much as he ever can, and making the right decisions that he thinks are in the best interests of the country. And whenever he does that, his polling numbers go up, and people who had some doubts about him think, you know, maybe he's still the best choice. When he gets into trouble is when it looks as though his motives are more partisan, near-term political. And that's why his use of that language is kind of a bad signal to send to the rest of the caucus, and it unnerves voters who are thinking, I don't know if this is a good mission for Canada to be involved in. I don't have the kind of detailed knowledge to understand the choices involved in getting involved in Syria. But I'd like to believe that the Prime Minister understands how serious a choice this is, and that he treats it seriously when questions are raised about it. So for him, tone matters so much, and it's important to start well and continue consistently in that direction.
Politics is always there in any decision, inevitably. I don't think that either the Prime Minister is doing this just for political gain. I don't think his opponents are opposing him just for political gain. I think there's principle and reasons on all sides. I think that Bruce's point earlier on is absolutely well taken, that there are enormous potential downsides politically for the government if things turn badly. So I don't think they would, even if you were cynical about it, I don't think they would take that lightly, that possibility lightly. At the same time, I don't think that it has to be a, quote, a popular war for them to benefit from it, because they only need to have the 40%, let's say, if it turns out that way, that favored it. If it's like a lot of issues, if it's only 40%, that's 40% they own, and the rest is split between the two other parties. One of the interesting things with this kind of issue is it has left no room for the Liberals to try to straddle between the two parties. And you saw on the day Justin Trudeau basically taking the same position effectively as the NDP on this. So you've got two parties opposed to the extension of the mission, one party in favor of it.
One thing that's interesting to watch with the NDP, they are now positioning themselves, they're not calling it the Iraq War or the Syria War, they're calling it the Harper War.
Yeah, with 60 other countries involved is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, but you know, we've seen this before when they try to attach it to a name, and it's an old Reform Party trick that they used against Mulroney. We're out of time.